So, where is terrorism going in 2021? Hi, this is Phil Gurski, President and CEO of Borealis Threat and Risk Consulting in Russell, Canada. You're listening to Canadian Intelligence, eh? I am really proud. I know it's pride is the right word. Most Canadians are supposed to be quiet, shy people, but I'm really proud to announce that this is the 100th episode of Canadian Intelligence, which used to be called An Intelligent Look at Terrorism. And I changed the name after a contest where I asked my friends what they thought it should be. And my sister-in-law said, well, what about Canadian Intelligence, which is CIA for short. Covered an awful lot of topics in the past couple of years to do with terrorism and national security. And one of the most popular episodes I've ever done was with a great American thinker, practitioner when it comes to counterterrorism named Brian Jenkins. He was on my podcast last August. And I've decided, in order to mark this occasion, to invite Brian back for take two. So, Brian, thanks very much for joining me on this podcast. So, a lot has happened, Brian, since we last spoke. Of course, COVID is still raging. I'm not sure if it's raging as badly in the United States as it is here in Canada still. Certainly in Ontario it is. One thing, Brian, I found really quite fascinating over the past year or so are a lot of very dire Cassandra-like predictions that the COVID epidemic in the West, not only in the West, but primarily in the West, would lead to this amazing, terrible wave of terrorism as a lot of very frustrated, perhaps unemployed in some cases, or not doing well economically, or people angry at big government and the lack of action, took to arms, i.e., engaged in violent extremism, which we could call terrorism. And yet, for the most part, that has not been manifest, at least not in your country and my country. Do you have any idea why all the so-called experts are wrong on this one, Brian?
Would not myself have predicted, I would not have forecast a dramatic increase in terrorism in the West as a consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic. First of all, some important caveats here. The pandemic is still ongoing. While it has improved in the United States for the time being, we still see surges taking place elsewhere in the world. Unfortunately, there have been surges in Canada. We've seen surges in Europe. People are concerned about new variants coming into being. And so we really don't know where we are yet. This is, hopefully, we are on the downhill side of this. We can't say that with a degree of high confidence yet. And so, in a sense, the dice are still tumbling down the table.
Right.
Second, we have seen some manifestations of defiance, particularly defiance of rules imposed by governments to slow the spread of the virus. We've seen resistance to the lockdowns, resistance to the wearing of masks. We're running into strong resistance in some places to accepting vaccination. And so certainly we have seen demonstrations. We have seen defiance of rules. We do have in the United States at least one episode where the authorities uncovered a plot to kidnap and presumably murder the governor of Michigan,
Right.
the state of Michigan, because of opposition to her lockdown policies. So we do have some manifestations of defiance. We have in other circumstances. I mean, we have some evidence here and there of disorder. But to be sure, it has not yet manifested itself into a sudden upsurge in terrorist campaigns. We have seen let me try to get this right. We certainly have seen a lot of chatter online about how to weaponize the virus.
Mm-hmm.
That is, people talking about, for example, on one extremist website, a discussion that if you find yourself infected with the virus, visit your local mosque, your local synagogue, your ethnically diverse neighborhood. In other words, attempting to use the virus as a means of infecting, affecting various adversaries or targets of prejudice. That's nothing new in the history of epidemics in the world. Very frequently, blame for the outbreak of disease
Mm-hmm.
is, I should say that again, that the other
Right.
minorities, foreigners, others are blamed for the outbreak of the disease. In the United States, unfortunately, there was a pattern of on the part of political leadership to call this the China flu
Mm-hmm.
or Kung flu,
Mm-hmm.
and we have seen a sharp increase in violence directed against Asian Americans, often by people shouting at them to go back to China, blaming them for bringing the flu. Again, that's not new in the history of epidemics. During the Middle Ages, Jews were blamed and attacked for bringing the virus. In other epidemics, various minorities or foreigners were the targets of not only blame, but were the targets of violence.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have seen that. Phil, let me go back to one point I started to talk about in terms of some of these some of the speculation online and exhortation online to weaponize the virus. There, for the most part, I believe that these are how should I say this? For the most part, these are white supremacist fantasies. There is an obsession on the far right with biological warfare, with so-called bioterrorism. It in a sense fits with the conceptual thinking of genocide, a way to wipe out an entire race or ethnic group. It also tends to fuel the nightmares of survivalists and preppers who anticipate that the virus, the pandemic, will lead to a breakdown of social order, and that they have to be prepared with weapons and food and hideouts to defend themselves. So there is a kind of historic obsession on that end of the spectrum with the notions of biological warfare. For the most part, I think these are online fantasies.
Mm-hmm.
We do not have evidence of any serious plotting, at least not that I know of yet. The current pandemic does not provide terrorists with any new capabilities, or indeed point to paths that they haven't already thought about. I mean, we do know that terrorists have in the past experimented with various forms of bioweapons. Most of the time, these consist of anthrax, or ricin or botulinum toxin, anthrax, is a bacteria that can infect an individual. Botulinum toxin and ricin are toxins derivative from biological substances. They're not contagious. We really have not seen, even in the realm of terrorism, again beyond fantasies, notions of weaponizing contagious.
Brian, I want to pick up, there's an awful lot in that response you gave me. I want to pick up on one thing in particular, and this is this notion that you talk about these fantasies. It was certainly my experience in working in Canadian intelligence, more specifically on Islamist extremism, that the vast majority of people that talk the good talk online never did anything, either because they were incompetent or incapable or simply cowards. Do you think a lot of this really is just talk, in the sense that some of these things are pretty complicated, right? And sometimes rocket science really is rocket science. And you have mentioned that several groups have mused about and even experimented with working with toxins in the past, the terrorist groups, but none of them have really mastered it in the sense that this becomes the number one priority for security intelligence and law enforcement. I mean, I guess never say never, but is that kind of part of the problem, is that they're dealing with issues that, frankly, they don't know anything really about, and therefore their desire to use it to cause a genocide or a mass attack is really, as you say, nothing but fantasy?
I do think a lot of it is fantasy. It is difficult to do. And what we have seen in actual attempts have been relatively amateurish attempts, for example, to spread ricin. There were some more concerted efforts by Aum Shinrikyo
Yes.
in Japan, which again involved various toxins. They did not succeed. They did succeed in carrying out, of course, a large-scale attack in 1995 on Tokyo subways using sarin, which was chemical warfare, not biological warfare.
Right.
But their biological warfare attempts simply produced no discernible results. So part of it is simply it's difficult to do. Part of it may also derive from some notions about utility. That would apply especially when we come to the realm of contagious diseases. I mean, one thing that COVID-19 reminds us is that in today's world, if there is a new dangerous virus that crosses over into the human population that does not have built-in defenses against it, that can spread throughout the world very rapidly. I mean, it's a matter of a few days with
Right.
today's modern transportation, and therefore it is a completely indiscriminate weapon. So if somewhere in the world, in some cave, there was a hypothetical a terrorist that wanted to poison people in the West, or kill only Christians, or kill Jews, that would be tough to control in a contagious disease scenario. And while certainly these diseases, contagious diseases, can wreak havoc in the West, as we have seen, where the countries in North America and Europe have suffered heavily, when they reach countries of the world that have less developed public health systems, there we can see really even larger scale death. Now, we don't know what that is just yet in terms of COVID-19. Number one, the COVID-19 is still moving around the world, and we've seen now dramatic increases in India. We were seeing some fairly dramatic increases in some of the countries in Africa and the Middle East. So we don't know how this is going to play out yet. And we don't know exactly what the extent of that is, because in the West, we do have fairly reliable reporting systems that can give us more or less an accurate count of the fatalities resulting from the virus. We don't have that same kind of reporting in much of the developing area of the world, and so we really don't have a good idea of how many people, even now, how many people have died. That may take us months, even years, to do the calculations of what is the ultimate toll of the virus. I go back to the so-called Hong Kong flu in 1968, and the estimated worldwide death toll from the Hong Kong flu was between 1 and 4 million. Now, that's a pretty big spread.
Mm-hmm.
And as I say, we shall see where we come out on this one. So again, we don't have the final figures, but it does show that you cannot easily target
Right.
a particular ethnic, religious, or political group using a contagious disease. It's uncontrollable.
Right. You referred earlier, Brian, to the fact that some of these fantasies, or a lot of the fantasies online, are tied to what you call white supremacists. Other terms are, far-right extremism, right-wing extremism, etc. If there's been one theme over the past, I'd say 12 to 18, maybe 24 months, it's that terrorism internationally is shifting. So you know very well, and you've written extensively about it, as have I, that the flavor of the day for the past 2 decades at least, if not more, has been Islamist extremism, i.e. jihadis. And we all know about, 9/11, but attacks in your country, in my country, in Western Europe, around the world. But there seems to be this notion now that we need to shift gears. We need to refocus our law enforcement, security intelligence, perhaps our military, to face this new beast, which isn't really very new. It's been around for a very long time, as you know as well as I do. I mean, hell, we had far-right investigations in the 1990s here in Canada. Do you think that this is an accurate call for change? Because I'm noting, in terms of on a daily basis around the world, the vast majority of actual attacks where groups actually kill or wound people still is 99% being perpetrated by Islamist extremist groups. Not normally in the West, although we just saw another attack in just outside of Paris the other day, where a policewoman was stabbed to death by a Tunisian yelling Allahu Akbar, and the French police have determined he was in fact radicalized. So despite the fact that the vast majority of attacks worldwide seem to be perpetrated still by Islamist extremists, all that anyone in your country and mine wants to talk about is the far right this and the far right that. Are we barking up the wrong tree here, or is this some kind of an early warning system that shows our authorities where they should look next?
First of all, with regard to the current state of jihadism worldwide, what has happened are some changes in the trajectory of jihadist terrorism. I don't think the jihadist threat is over by any means. I mean, this is a continuing threat. The jihadist global enterprise has shown itself to be really persistent, resilient, adaptive, and we have a number of times in the last 20 years or so claimed, either in a particular country or even worldwide, that strategic victory was in sight, only then to be disappointed and see it make another comeback. It is opportunistic, and while we thought it was on the downhill side in perhaps 2010 2010 or so. The Arab Spring in 2011 gave it another opportunity, which certainly was exploited in Syria and Iraq, and it led to the creation of the Islamic State.
Right.
The destruction of the Islamic State as a territorial expression has not meant the destruction of the so-called Islamic State as a terrorist phenomenon. The groups in Syria and Iraq continue to operate. They probably still dominate swathes of territory in the region, although they have necessarily adopted a more underground approach. So we don't have an overt manifestation of the Islamic State. At the same time, the cadres of the Islamic State have fanned out to various other Islamic fronts, certainly in Africa, in the Middle East, and in Asia, where we have seen, in fact, as you point out, increases in violence. The strategy has shifted somewhat from Al-Qaeda's focus on the far enemy, that is the West in general and the United States in particular, and sees itself now surviving by embedding itself in local insurgencies and radicalizing those. So all the way from Boko Haram in Nigeria to the various groups operating across the Sahel in Africa. Al-Shabaab in Somalia is still very active, and we see new manifestations of jihadism, most recently in Mozambique.
Right.
So this is still an ongoing activity, albeit in a different form. We are also in this year we have seen the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Somalia, although they continue to operate in the region. We have seen drawdowns in other places, and of course, the United States and the NATO allies have now all declared that we will be out of Afghanistan by September. And honestly, we don't know what's going to happen next. This is a bit of a gamble. The latest assessment suggests that it's entirely possible that the government of Afghanistan, without Western assistance, could fall. What does that mean for Islamic State and Al-Qaeda operatives in that region of the world? So we have some things on the horizon that we're uncertain about. And what we've also seen, last December there was an indictment in the U.S. Department of Justice that was unsealed, which revealed a plot by Al-Shabaab in Somalia to train a pirate in the Philippines. They were looking at how to breach cockpit doors and thinking about targets for another, albeit smaller scale, 9/11 style of attack.
Oh, I hadn't seen that one. Wow.
Now, it was a plot that was interrupted. We can assess that it may have been a reach, that it wasn't near a mature operational plan yet, but it is evidence of intent. That is, so long as this phenomenon continues, as long as there are these groups that are still active, they are going to be thinking about ways to come after us. In January of this year, there was a U.S. soldier arrested for offering his assistance to Islamic State to carry out an attack on the 9/11 memorial in New York City. Again, this was an individual that ran into a police undercover operation, but he was willing to go ahead and participate in it. And this is another change that I think that we are seeing as these groups have increasingly relied on remote recruiting, that is, recruiting through exhortation, primarily on the internet and social media. They are reaching out to volunteers to attempt to inspire them to carry out attacks. Fortunately, for the most part, the operational capabilities of these individuals are limited, and so we see things like car rammings and stabbing attacks. Some of the lower level attacks that we've seen recently in Europe, which remains on high alert because of this issue, especially France, and so in addition to groups that are actively fighting, although for the time being focused on local issues in order to survive, the international aspects of this have not been abandoned. They're still coming at us. So I would not dismiss jihadis at all as a potential threat on the horizon.
So, Brian, I mean, I 1,000% agree with you. And I've been saying this for the past, 20 years now. So why is it that you look at the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Globe and Mail here in Canada, and the only thing that so-called experts, terrorism experts, national security experts want to talk about is this, this incredible rise of the far right, and that, I hope our security services and law enforcement are retooling to look at all these other bad actors, because if they're not, they're worried about yesterday's threat. The new threat is from the far right. Now, I think you would agree with me. The far right is a threat. It manifests itself in different ways in different countries. I'm gonna ask you about January the 6th in a minute, but do you not? I mean, do you disagree with me, or is this is this also like a false dichotomy that people are drawing here, that you either look at jihadis or you look at the far right? You can't look at both simultaneously. And, oh, by the way, we think the far right demands the vast majority of resources. Or am I misinterpreting the way that I'm reading the media these days?
No, I don't think that's a misinterpretation. As I say, I think the fact that, in terms of the media, the media is not very good at long-term perspectives, either historically or looking into the future. And so the media tends to move along in its own very short time horizon, time capsule, if you will. And does it they do tend to reinforce each other too in terms of message. Now, to be sure, we have seen over the last several years at least in the United States, a surge in right-wing right-wing violence. Now we have to keep in mind, right-wing is really an assemblage of causes. There's no single doctrine here. I mean, we're talking about white supremacism, we're talking about anti-Semitism, we're talking about anti-immigration, anti-foreign, opposition to abortion. It is, there are a lot of banners there about the what we are seeing, which is a cause for some concern in the United States, is we're seeing a coalescence of some of these diverse strands into into a broader, more encompassing movement, which has focused its wrath on the federal government.
Mm-hmm.
And so that coalescence is a change. We have seen a surge in right-wing violence in Europe. That has come about in part in reaction to the dramatic influx of immigrants
right.
From the Middle East, from North Africa, and there they do face some real problems there, and it's not exclusively on the right. I mean, we see what's happening in France. We've seen a recent thing where a number of former military leaders in France have warned about the country descending into civil war between, jihadists on the one hand, if you will,
mm-hmm.
an unassimilated Muslim population, and on the other hand, right-wing, extreme right-wing opponents of this. And so that polarization is something that is a cause for concern. And I mention that because I think one of the concerns that we have in the United States is the increasing polarization of our politics.
Right.
As you point out, look, these we're talking when we talk about right wing, and again, I use that only as a generic term, but these strands of white supremacism, of in some cases Christian identity, anti-Semitism, these comprise a continuing dark stream in American history. This goes back to the early 19th century and even before that, even before the founding of the American Republic. So this is not new. We know that this particular stream, this particular current in American history broadens during times of economic stress, of societal stress, and indeed, I think to a certain extent has been fueled by the pandemic in a variety of ways. I mean, the pandemic has done one thing. It's led to a great deal of isolation. A lot of people spending too much time alone in front of their computers, and that is a recipe for self-radicalization, and we see that we have examples of that occurring. So this is something that is not new. It but responds to stress.
Mm-hmm.
And clearly, given the political polarization in American society, this is a cause of great concern. My own personal view, as I've been writing about this, is that, first of all, it is a cause for concern right now. It is not new. Keep in mind the numbers. While people talk about the total, that right-wing terrorism exceeds the total of jihadist terrorism in the United States since 9/11. That is true, but in both cases, the numbers are very, very low. We're talking about, in the case of at least this side of 9/11, a total of a few over 100 people have been killed as a consequence of jihadist terrorists. Almost half of them in one single episode. An individual with a weapon who killed 49 people
in Orlando, yeah.
At the Pulse nightclub in Orlando.
Yeah.
And if we look at the right wing contribution, again, It is a few more than 100, but the numbers are relatively small, especially when we keep in mind the United States' very high tolerance for violence. I mean, we have approximately 16,000 criminal homicides a year.
Right.
So over a 20-year period, the fact that there are 5 or 6 killed as a consequence of jihadi terrorism on average, or maybe 6 or 7 killed as a consequence of right-wing extremist violence, on the other hand, I don't want to say that not every single death is a tragedy. Of course it is, but this is not going to bring down a republic.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think it's a very good point.
And that we can deal with this. This is a police matter. It will be different from dealing with jihadists, and I think it, in many respects, may be more difficult than dealing with the jihadists. But if we don't overreact, we can handle this. American institutions are flexible and durable. We can come through this. The biggest danger in the United States is not some handful of people, again, fantasizing online about infecting Muslim, Jewish, or African American communities with COVID-19. The real concern I think we have in our society is the poisonous political partisanship. It's become so divided in our society. We have lost our sense of community has eroded. In our Congress, we've lost any sense of comity.
Yes.
As the political rhetoric has become coarse. And the biggest concern that I have is not our ability to deal with people who would carry out acts of violence, but rather that political violence will simply become endemic in our American political system. And therefore, in terms of how we handle this, I think we have to be very, very careful. And the first rule would be the Hippocratic caution.
Do no harm.
Do no harm. So we could easily make this worse.
Well, let's certainly hope that a lot of the mistakes in the so-called war and terror over the past 20 years don't get repeated. But I got to pick up on one last thing, Brian. You talked about this poisonous political debate in your country. You talk about the chasm between, obviously, the Republicans and Democrats about worldviews and whither America and where it should be going. Let me pin you down. January 6th at the Capitol. Was that an act of terrorism or not? Many said it was. I pushed back saying I didn't think so. Perhaps it's an unfair question to ask, but would you consider what happened on that day an act of terrorism or not?
I have a number of colleagues that say it technically meets the definition of terrorism as defined in the criminal statutes of the United States. There are also claims that it meets the qualifications for an act of insurrection, and we seem to be addicted to calling the participants insurrectionists, which strikes me as this sort of odd 19th century word. And others are saying this is sedition. The fact is that whether or not it technically meets those definitions is irrelevant. My own view is that as we deal with violence or the threat of violence coming from either side of the political spectrum, that we ought not to utilize terms or strategies that carry a lot of political freight.
Right, right.
I mean, for a member of a mob invading the Capitol to be called an insurrectionist or a terrorist may be considered an upgrade. We have ample criminal statutes, and I know there is some enthusiasm right now in Congress for the creation of new domestic terrorism laws. We don't need it.
Right.
We don't need it. We have ample criminal statutes, and my view would be investigate and prosecute on the basis of existing criminal statutes. I cannot actually recall the last prosecution we had for insurrection unless I go back before the American Civil War.
Wow.
And the last prosecutions that we had of domestic extremists on sedition charges failed.
Okay.
It is. I think it's just poor strategy to rely on these. You know, people lament. I saw some articles recently lamenting that we did not have a terrorism statute to prosecute Timothy McVeigh, who carried out the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, in which 168 people were killed. And the fact is, we did not prosecute him for insurrection, for sedition, or for terrorism.
Mass murder.
He was prosecuted in federal court for murdering 8 federal police officers. And the reason for selecting the 8 federal police officers out of the 168 fatalities was that killing a federal police officer in a federal court is a capital
offense. Right, of course.
And he was charged, convicted, and executed for the murder of 8 federal police officers. At the same time, had that charge failed, there was a backup charge in the state of Oklahoma charging him with 168 counts of murder.
Okay.
Now, that sufficed, and I think that was appropriate. He made ample comments about his political motivations. In my view, he was convicted of his actions not because of his political beliefs.
Right.
And I don't think we should give a damn about his political beliefs.
Yeah.
Should a court become a forum for political pretensions? And therefore, as prosecutors proceed with charges against either the participants in the January 6th mob action at the U.S. Capitol, or in other future crimes, I would say you've got criminal statutes to do it. Do it within those criminal statutes. Go after and come down hard on those who are actually plotting to carry out serious crimes. But, you know, we have over 500 people have now been charged in the January 6th event. About 80 to 90% of those people are ordinary people who believe they were intervening to prevent an election from being stolen. Now, they may be wrong. They may be foolish, and that's not going to be a defense against a charge of breaking into a federal building or other charges. But we want to go after violent extremists without making half the country enemies of the state.
So many good points there, Brian. Looking at laws, new laws, rejigging laws in the aftermath of a tragedy is generally the worst time you can possibly do so, because emotions are running high. For what it's worth, I saw most of the people that were involved in the January 6th mob, as you called it, at the Capitol. I saw it as almost like a frat party gone wrong. I think a lot of the people, got there, and then because of a very poor security presence, found themselves inside the building. A public guy said, "Hey, Bob, holy shit, we're inside the Capitol. Now what do we do? This wasn't the plan." I think there's been an awful lot of rhetoric thrown about with respect to that particular day, and again, has led to a lot of calls for changes, which, as you say, are not necessary. We here in Canada have prosecuted many cases of what are probably acts of terrorism without resort to the terrorism clause in the Canadian Criminal Code. Because, as you said, you can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that person A killed person B. It's a hell of a lot tougher to prove why person A killed person B if there's some kind of underlying political, ideological, or religious motivation, which is what the Canadian Criminal Code defines terrorism as. Brian, you know what? I'm thinking there's a part 3. There are so many things that you and I could speak about terrorism. I just want to thank you very, very much once again for agreeing to come on as a part 2 to this podcast. I have followed you for a great many years. I think you really are one of the outstanding American practitioners and thinkers about terrorism. And I wish you many more years of thinking and strategizing about this. And hopefully there's a part 3 in our conversation at some point.
Well, I've been at this for almost 50 years, and I tell people, give me another 50 years, I'll have it all sorted out.
Well, I'm looking at 40, Brian, so I'm 10 years behind you. But let's hope we both stay healthy enough to have that further conversation. Thanks so much for joining me again.
Thank you, Phil.
Okay, you take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. So that was my second conversation with Brian Jenkins. You'll see his bio on my website. As I said, he is one of the deans of terrorism studies internationally. It has been for 50 years. So what do you think of our conversation? I'd like to hear your feedback. You can reach me on email, borealisrisk@gmail.com, or on Twitter at borealissaves. You also find me on LinkedIn and on Facebook. If you like the content, want to subscribe, go to the website, borealisthreatandrisk.com, hit the subscribe button, get all the all the material free of charge to your inbox every morning, as well as a link to my new book, The Peaceable Kingdom, A History of Terrorism, Canada, Confederation of the Present. Love to hear from you. I'll talk to you again soon. Well, after today is the second centenary, or the second 100-fold of this Canadian Intelligence Day. We'll see where we go next.